Before the Spanish sails ever touched the horizon, the Aztec Empire was already rising, brilliant, brutal, and breathtakingly complex, from floating gardens to feathered gods, and marketplaces that rivaled the size of European cities. The world of the Aztecs thrived in rhythm with sacred calendars and sunlit rituals. But when the drums fell silent at night, what stories did the stars whisper above Tenochtitlan? Lay back and let the myths, mysteries, and moonlit echoes of the Aztec world cradle you to sleep. Subscribe for more dreamy dives into forgotten empires. And don't forget to tap the bell icon so every night brings a new chapter of peaceful, fascinating history. Let us begin our story in a place that exists more in memory than on any map you could trace with your finger today. Picture, if you will, a people moving slowly across the landscape of what would become Mexico, carrying with them nothing more than their beliefs, their language, and an unshakable faith in a prophecy that seemed, to any reasonable observer, rather impractical. These were the Mexica, though history would come to know them by another name, entirely the Aztecs, and their journey from their mythical homeland of Aztlan would take them nearly 2 centuries to complete. The year was sometime in the early 1100s, and across the Valley of Mexico, various tribes were settling into the rich lakeland that would become the heart of one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations. The Chichimecs had arrived first, followed by the Tapanecs, and then came the Akalua, each group claiming portions of the fertile valleys surrounding the interconnected lakes that dominated the landscape. But the Mexica were latecomers to this already crowded region, and their arrival was met with something between suspicion and outright hostility from the established peoples. What made their situation particularly challenging was not merely their late arrival, but the rather specific nature of their religious mission. Their patron deity, Huitzilopochtli, had given them what could generously be called very particular instructions. They were to wander until they found a place where they would see an eagle perched upon a cactus, devouring a snake. Only there, according to their god, should they establish their permanent home. For a people who had been walking for decades, carrying their possessions on their backs and living as nomads in a region where all the good land was already claimed, this prophecy must have seemed both a blessing and a curse. The Mexica's journey through the Valley of Mexico was marked by a series of temporary settlements, alliances, and conflicts that revealed both their desperation and their remarkable adaptability. They served as mercenaries for more established cities, offering their military skills in exchange for temporary refuge. They were, by all accounts, fierce warriors, but they were also a people without a homeland, constantly moving from place to place as their welcome wore thin or their services were no longer required. During these wandering years, they settled briefly in places like Chapultepec, a hill that provided both defensive advantages and access to fresh water. But even there, their growing numbers and their reputation as formidable fighters made their neighbors nervous. The Culhuacan people eventually forced them to move on, and the Mexica found themselves once again searching for a place where they could establish something more permanent than a temporary camp. The social structure of the Mexica during these wandering years was necessarily different from what it would become once they settled. Leadership was often determined by military prowess and the ability to negotiate with other peoples. The warrior class held particular importance, not merely because of the constant threat of conflict, but because military service to other city-states was often their primary means of survival. Yet even during this nomadic period, the seeds of their later organizational genius were apparent in the way they maintained their cohesion as a people, despite decades of uncertainty and displacement. Their religious practices during this time were likewise adapted to their nomadic lifestyle. Huitzilopochtli traveled with them, carried in the form of a sacred bundle that contained the god's physical presence. This portable deity became the center of their spiritual life, and the prophecy of the eagle, cactus, and snake served as both a constant reminder of their destiny and a source of hope during their most difficult moments. They conducted ceremonies wherever they camped, adapting their rituals to temporary altars and makeshift temples that could be assembled and dismantled. As they moved, what strikes the modern observer about this period is the sheer tenacity required to maintain not only their physical survival, but their cultural identity across generations of wandering. Children were born and raised on this long journey, learning the stories of Aslan not as history, but as lived experience, carrying forward the prophecy that their parents and grandparents had followed across hundreds of miles of challenging terrain. The educational system that would later become formalized in schools was, during these years, purely oral stories told around cooking fires. Lessons in survival passed down from experienced warriors to young men who would need to fight for their people's continued existence. Yet for all their hardships, Mexico were learning skills that would serve them well when they finally did settle. Their decades of serving as mercenaries taught them the military strategies of various peoples. Their constant negotiation for resources and territory gave them diplomatic experience that would prove invaluable when they later built their empire. Most importantly, their status as outsiders gave them a unique perspective on the political dynamics of the Valley of Mexico. They understood the weaknesses and strengths of the established powers in ways that those powers did not understand themselves. As we consider this long period of wandering, we might wonder what sustained a people through such extended uncertainty. But perhaps the answer lies not in the destination they sought, but in the journey itself, and in the gradual transformation of a nomadic tribe into something that would soon become far more formidable than anyone in the Valley of Mexico could half anticipated. By the early 1300s, the Mexica had been wandering for nearly 200 years, and their situation had become increasingly precarious. The Valley of Mexico was more crowded than ever, with established city-states controlling all the prime agricultural land around the interconnected lake system. The Mexica found themselves repeatedly pushed to the margins, literally and figuratively, until they were forced to consider territory that no one else particularly wanted: the marshy, seemingly worthless islands in the middle of Lake Texcoco. These islands were hardly what anyone would consider prime real estate. They were swampy, difficult to reach, and surrounded by the brackish waters of the lake's center, where the water was too salty for drinking and too shallow for easy navigation by large vessels. The soil was muddy and unstable, hardly suitable for the kind of agriculture that sustained the great cities around the lake shores. For most peoples, these islands would have represented not an opportunity, but a form of exile, a place to be avoided rather than embraced. But it was here, according to their histories, that the Mexica finally saw the sign they had been waiting for centuries to witness. On one of these unpromising islands, they found an eagle perched atop a prickly peared cactus, devouring a snake. The prophecy of Huitzilopochtli had been fulfilled, and the long wandering was over. The year was 1325. Though the exact date remains a matter of scholarly debate, the Mexica themselves would later claim it was March 13, 1325. A date chosen perhaps as much for its symbolic importance as for its historical accuracy. What followed was one of the most remarkable examples of environmental engineering in the pre-Columbian Americas. The Mexica did not simply accept the limitations of their marshy island home. Instead, they set about transforming it into something that could support not just survival, but prosperity. The process began with the most basic challenge: creating stable ground on which to build. Using techniques they had learned during their long journey, they began driving wooden stakes into the lake bed and weaving between them woven mats and branches, then filling these frameworks with stones, earth, and debris to create artificial platforms. This was exhausting, painstaking work that required the entire community to participate. Men, women, and children spent their days in the shallow, muddy waters, gathering materials, carrying loads of earth and stone, and gradually expanding their tiny foothold in the lake. The work was made more difficult by the fact that they had to import most of their materials from the mainland, either by trading with other peoples or by undertaking expeditions to gather what they needed from unoccupied areas around the lake. The earliest structures in what would become Tenochtitlan were modest in the extreme simple huts made from reeds and mud, raised on these artificial platforms to keep them above the water level during the lake's seasonal fluctuations. Fresh water was a constant concern, as the lake water was too brackish to drink. So the Mexica had to construct elaborate systems to channel fresh water from springs on the mainland, building their first causeways not for grand ceremonial purposes, but for the simple necessity of survival. But even in these early years, your organizational genius that would characterize the Aztec Empire was beginning to emerge. The community was divided into calpulli neighborhood units that functioned as both residential areas and work groups. Each calpulli was responsible for particular tasks in the construction and maintenance of the growing settlement. Some specialized in gathering reeds and other marsh plants for construction. Others focused on the importation of stone and earth. Still others took responsibility for food production and the construction of the Chinampa agricultural system that would eventually make Tenochtitlan one of the most productive cities in the world. These calpulli were not merely work units. They were also the basic social and political organizations that would govern daily life in the growing city. Each had its own leader, usually an older man with experience in both construction and diplomacy, and its own patron deity, usually a local manifestation of one of the major gods of the Mexica pantheon. The calpulli also served as the basic military unit when threats arose. The men of each calpulli would organize themselves into fighting formations, with their neighborhood loyalty serving as the foundation for military discipline. The early religious life of Tenochtitlan was necessarily simple, conducted in temporary structures that could be quickly rebuilt if damaged by storms or floods. But even these modest temples followed the essential patterns that would characterize Aztec religious architecture: a raised platform facing west toward the setting sun, with space for both public ceremonies and private rituals. Huitzilopochtli was honored with the first permanent temple, a modest structure that would eventually be replaced by the great Templo Mayor that would dominate the city's skyline. Perhaps most importantly, these early years established the pattern of intensive cooperation that would characterize Aztec society. The challenges of building a city in a lake required every member of the community to contribute their labor and skills. There were no idle nobles in early Tenochtitlan. Everyone worked on the construction projects that gradually transformed their marshy refuge into something approaching a real town. This shared labor created social bonds that transcended the traditional divisions between warriors, craftspeople, and farmers, and established a civic culture that valued practical achievement above theoretical status. At the diet of the early Tenochtitlan residents was necessarily simple and heavily dependent on the resources they could extract from the lake itself. They became expert fishermen, developing sophisticated techniques for catching the various species that lived in the lake's different zones. They gathered waterfowl eggs, hunted ducks, and other birds that frequented the marshes, and learned to harvest the various edible plants that grew in and around the water. This intimate knowledge of their aquatic environment would later inform their development of the Chinampa agricultural system. But in these early years, it was simply a matter of eating whatever the lake could provide. Yet even as they struggled with these basic challenges of survival, the Mexica were beginning to develop the diplomatic and military relationships that would eventually allow them to transform their island refuge into the center of an empire. They served as mercenaries for various mainland powers, using their reputation as fierce fighters to secure both income and allies. They also began the careful process of intermarriage with noble families from established cities, gradually building the network of relationships that would support their later rise to power. As the first generation of children born in Tenochtitlan grew to adulthood, the city began to take on the characteristics that would define it for the next 2 centuries. But the question that hung over all these achievements was whether this remarkable experiment in urban engineering could sustain itself, and whether the Mexica could transform their island home into something more than just an elaborate survival strategy. By the 1380s, Tenochtitlan had grown from a desperate settlement of refugees into something that no one in the Valley of Mexico could afford to ignore. What had begun as a few hundred people living in reed huts on artificial islands had become a city of several thousand inhabitants, with permanent stone buildings, sophisticated water management systems, and most importantly, a military reputation that commanded respect from the established powers around the lake. The transformation was so rapid and so complete that even the Mexica themselves might have struggled to recognize the modest community they had founded just 60 years earlier. The key to this transformation lay not in any single dramatic event, but in the accumulated effect of thousands of small innovations and improvements. The Chinampa system. Those artificial agricultural islands that the Spanish would later call floating gardens had evolved from simple platforms for survival into an incredibly productive Teachville agricultural complex that could feed not only Tenochtitlan's growing population but produce surplus crops for trade. Each Chinampa was a masterpiece of environmental engineering, carefully designed to take advantage of the lake's natural cycles while maximizing the productivity of every square foot of artificial soil. The construction of these Chinampas required a level of precision and planning that revealed the mathematical and engineering skills the Mexica had developed during their years of city building. Each plot was typically about 30 meters long and 2.5 meters wide, staked out on the lake bed with a fence woven between the stakes, then filled with layers of mud, decaying vegetation, and human waste to create incredibly rich growing soil. The channels between the Chinampas served multiple purposes. They provided transportation routes for canoes carrying harvested crops. They supplied the water that kept the artificial soil moist, and they served as sources of the mud and organic matter that had to be constantly added to maintain the soil's fertility. But the Chinampas were only one aspect of Tenochtitlan's growing sophistication. The city itself was becoming a marvel of urban planning, with a layout that reflected both practical considerations and profound religious beliefs. The center of the city was dominated by the ceremonial district, where the Templo Mayor rose in stepped pyramid form to honor both Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, the rain god, whose favor was essential for the agricultural productivity that supported the city's growth. Around this ceremonial center, the city was divided into 4 quarters, each with its own temples, schools, and administrative buildings connected by canals and causeways that made transportation efficient even as the city continued to expand. The population growth during this period was remarkable, not just in its speed, but in its composition. Tenochtitlan was attracting not only Mexica families who had remained in the surrounding areas during the early years of settlement, but also immigrants from other ethnic groups who were drawn by the city's growing reputation. It's a place where skilled workers could find opportunities. Craftspeople specializing in stone carving, metal working, and textile production established workshops in the city, while merchants began using Tenochtitlan as a base for trading expeditions to distant regions. This demographic diversity created social dynamics that were more complex than anything the Mexica had experienced during their nomadic years. The cow pulley system adapted to accommodate people who shared neighborhoods but not necessarily ethnic backgrounds, evolving into something more like professional guilds than traditional kinship groups. The cow pulley of stoneworkers developed its own traditions and ceremonies, while the cow pulley of featherworkers created elaborate protocols for their specialized craft. Yet these diverse groups were unified by their shared commitment to the city's growth and their participation in the religious festivals that marked the passage of the seasons. The military evolution of Tenochtitlan during this period was equally dramatic. What had begun as a loose collection of warriors who fought as mercenaries for other powers gradually became a professional military organization with its own strategies, equipment, and command structure. The island location that had once been a liability became a tremendous strategic advantage. Enemies who wanted to attack Tenochtitlan had to approach across open water in canoes, where they were vulnerable too. Defenders who knew every channel and shallow spot in the lake. The causeways that connected the city to the mainland could be quickly broken to prevent enemy approach, while secret routes through the marshes allowed Tenochtitlan's forces to attack their enemies from unexpected directions. Perhaps more importantly, the Mexica were developing diplomatic skills to match their military capabilities. The leaders of Tenochtitlan were no longer merely war chiefs who could command the loyalty of their own people. They were becoming statesmen who could negotiate complex alliances with the established powers of the Valley of Mexico. Marriage alliances connected Tenochtitlan's ruling families to the noble houses of cities like Texcoco and Culhuacan, while trade agreements ensured that the city had access to resources that could not be produced on the Chinapa stone for construction. Luxury, goods for the growing noble class, and the raw materials that craftspeople needed for their workshops. The religious life of the city was also becoming more sophisticated, with the simple ceremonies of the early years giving way to elaborate festivals that drew participants from throughout the region. The calendar of religious observances that would eventually regulate all aspects of Aztec life was taking shape, with different ceremonies marking the agricultural cycle, the movement of celestial bodies, and the mythical events that defined Mexica identity. The priesthood was becoming a specialized profession, with young men from noble families dedicating their lives to the service of the gods and the maintenance of the complex rituals that ensured the city's continued prosperity. Education was likewise becoming formalized with the establishment of the first schools that would eventually evolve into the Comacac and Telpochcali systems that would educate Aztec youth for centuries to come. Noble children began receiving instruction not only in practical skills like warfare and administration, but in the complex body of knowledge that was considered essential for leadership: astronomy, mathematics, religious doctrine, and the historical traditions that connected present-day Tenochtitlan to the mythical homeland of Aztlan. Yet for all these achievements, the question that dominated political discussions in Tenochtitlan was whether the city could continue to grow and prosper while remaining subordinate to more established powers. The tribute payments that Tenochtitlan made to the Teponic Empire of Azcapotzalco were becoming increasingly burdensome, and there were growing voices within the city arguing that the Mexica were strong enough to chart their own course. The foundation had been laid for something much greater than a prosperous city-state. But the transformation from subjects to rulers would require changes that would test everything the Mexica had built during their first century in the lake. As the 14th century drew to a close, Tenochtitlan stood at a crossroads that would determine not just its own fate, but the future of all the peoples of central Mexico. The infrastructure was in place, the population was growing, the military was strong, and the diplomatic relationships were maturing. But the greatest test still lay ahead: whether this remarkable island city could transform itself from a regional power into the center of an empire that would dominate Mesoamerica for the next century and a half. The year 1428 marked what would become one of the most significant political transformations in Mesoamerican history. Though at the time it might have seemed like just another shift in the complex web of alliances that governed the Valley of Mexico, Itzcoatl, the fourth ruler of Tenochtitlan, had successfully negotiated an alliance with two other major powers: Texcoco, the city renowned for its learning and artistic achievement, and Tlacopan, a smaller but strategically important settlement. This triple alliance, as it came to be known, would serve as the foundation for what we now call the Aztec Empire. Though the reality of how this empire actually functioned day to day was far more complex and interesting than the term empire might suggest, what made this alliance particularly sophisticated was not the mere fact of cooperation between three cities. Such alliances were common in Mesoamerica, but the detailed division of responsibilities and benefits that the three partners negotiated. Tenochtitlan, with its growing military strength, would take primary responsibility for military campaigns and the conquest of new territories. Texcoco, with its established reputation for learning and administration, would provide the bureaucratic expertise needed to manage conquered territories and collect tribute. Tlacopan, though the smallest partner, controlled important routes through the western valleys and could facilitate trade and communication across the alliance's growing territory. The tribute system that emerged from this alliance was a marvel of administrative precision that required constant record-keeping, mathematical calculation, and logistical coordination. Each conquered city-state was required to pay specific quantities of particular goods at regular intervals, every 80 days, though some tributes were collected annually or semi-annually, depending on the nature of the goods involved. The Matricula de Tributos, the great tribute roll that recorded these obligations, reveals the extraordinary scope and complexity of the system. Feathers from tropical birds, precious metals, textiles of specific designs and dimensions, foodstuffs in predetermined quantities, and even live animals for ceremonial purposes. But the collection of tribute was only the beginning of a much more complex economic machine. Once goods arrived in Tenochtitlan, they had to be counted, cataloged, and distributed according to elaborate protocols that reflected both practical needs and social hierarchies. Certain types of tribute were reserved exclusively for the use of the ruling class: the exotic feathers that adorned ceremonial costumes, the precious stones that decorated religious objects, the fine textiles that marked noble status. Other goods were distributed to support the city's basic operations: food for the common people, raw materials for craftspeople, building materials for public works projects. The mathematics involved in managing this system was staggering. Scribes had to track not only what was owed by each tributary city, but what had been received, what had been distributed, and what remained in storage. They had to calculate exchange rates between different types of goods, anticipate shortfalls and surpluses, and coordinate delivery schedules to ensure that perishable goods arrived when they were needed. The development of sophisticated accounting methods was not a theoretical exercise, but a practical necessity for keeping an empire of this complexity functioning from day to day. The Triple Alliance also required unprecedented levels of communication across vast distances. Messages had to travel constantly between the three capital cities and their various subordinate settlements, carrying information about tribute collections, military campaigns, trade negotiations, and political developments. The runner system that the alliance developed was remarkably efficient, with relay stations positioned at regular intervals along the major routes, allowing messages to travel from Tenochtitlan to the farthest corners of the empire in a matter of days. These runners, known as chasqui, were not simply athletes who carried messages from point to point. They were trained specialists who had to memorize complex verbal messages, recognize the various types of official documents and tribute goods, and navigate the political sensitivities involved in communicating between different cities and ethnic groups. A runner carrying news of a successful military campaign would need to know not just the basic facts, but the appropriate diplomatic language to use when delivering the message to different audiences. A runner carrying tribute records would need to understand the accounting systems well enough to answer questions about discrepancies or delays. The scale of this communication system reveals something important about how the Triple Alliance actually functioned. This was not a centralized empire ruled directly from Tenochtitlan, but a complex network of relationships that required constant negotiation and coordination. Local rulers maintained significant autonomy over their own territories, but they operated within a framework of obligations and expectations that connected them to the alliance's broader political and economic systems. A local Tlatoani might make day-to-day decisions about agriculture, public works, and local justice without consulting anyone in Tenochtitlan. But he could not ignore the tribute schedule or refuse to provide warriors when military campaigns were planned. The religious dimension of the alliance was equally complex and equally important to its daily operations. The Triple Alliance was not just a political and economic arrangement. It was also a religious community with shared festivals, shared deities, and shared ceremonial obligations. The great religious festivals that marked the Aztec calendar were celebrated throughout the alliance's territory, with local variations that reflected regional traditions while maintaining overall unity. The tribute system itself had a strong religious component, as many of the goods collected were used in ceremonies and sacrifices that were believed to maintain the cosmic balance that kept the world functioning properly. The military organization of the alliance reflects the same attention to systematic planning and coordination. Rather than maintaining a single massive army, the alliance relied on the ability to mobilize warriors from throughout its territory for specific campaigns. Each tributary city was obligated to provide a certain number of warriors when called upon, and these local forces would be organized into larger military units under the command of experienced generals from one of the 3 alliance cities. This system allowed the alliance to field very large armies when necessary, while avoiding the enormous cost of maintaining professional soldiers during peacetime. The logistics of coordinating these military campaigns were as complex as any aspect of the alliance's operations. Food had to be stockpiled along campaign routes, weapons and equipment had to be distributed to local forces, and communication networks had to be established to coordinate movements across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. The alliance developed specialized roles for different types of warriors: scouts who could move quickly through unfamiliar territory, engineers who could construct bridges and fortifications, and specialists in particular weapons who could train local forces in new military techniques. Yet for all its sophistication, the system was constantly evolving and adapting to new challenges. As the alliance expanded into new territories with different climates, different resources, and different political traditions, the tribute system had to accommodate goods and customs that had never been part of the original framework. New types of records had to be developed, new administrative roles had to be created, and new diplomatic protocols had to be established for dealing with peoples whose languages and some customs were unfamiliar to the alliance's administrators. The question that loomed over all these achievements was whether a system of such complexity could maintain its coherence as it continued to expand. The Triple Alliance had created something unprecedented in Mesoamerican history, but the very success of their administrative innovations was creating new challenges that would test the limits of their organizational abilities. While the tribute system formed the backbone of the Aztec Empire's formal economy, there existed alongside it a parallel network of commerce that was in many ways even more sophisticated and certainly more far-reaching. The Pachteca, the professional, long-distance merchants of the empire, operated according to their own rules, maintained their own institutions, created trading relationships that extended far beyond the political boundaries of the Triple Alliance. Understanding how the Pachteca functioned provides insight into an aspect of an Aztec society that was both integral to the empire's success and remarkably independent of its formal political structure. The Pachteca were organized into hereditary guilds called calpulli. But these were very different from the neighborhood-based calpulli that formed the basic social units of Aztec cities. Membership in a Pachteca calpulli required not only birth into the right family, but approval from existing guild members and acceptance by the calpulli's lord. This selective membership created a tight-knit professional community that could maintain the high levels of trust and cooperation necessary for long-distance commerce in a world without banks, insurance companies, or standardized currencies. The trading expeditions organized by the Pachteca were elaborate affairs that required months or even years of preparation. A typical expedition might involve dozens of merchants pooling their resources to purchase trade goods, hire porters to carry the merchandise, and arrange for the guides and interpreters who would be necessary in foreign territories. The merchants themselves were skilled diplomats who had to navigate not only the practical challenges of moving goods across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain, but also the complex political relationships between the various city-states and ethnic groups they encountered along their routes. The goods that the Pachteca carried were not random collections of valuable items, but carefully selected inventories designed to meet specific demands in particular markets. From the Aztec heartland, they carried manufactured goods that showcased the technical skills of Tenochtitlan's craftspeople, textiles with intricate designs, obsidian tools and weapons of exceptional sharpness, and jewelry made from precious metals and stones. These goods were traded for raw materials that were either unavailable or difficult to obtain in the Valley of Mexico, tropical feathers from birds that lived only in distant rainforests, cacao beans from the lowland regions, precious stones from mines controlled by other peoples, and exotic foods that could command high prices in Tenochtitlan's markets. But the Pachteca were more than just merchants. They were also intelligence agents who gathered information about political developments, military preparations, and economic opportunities in the regions they visited. This intelligence was often as valuable to the empire as the trade goods they brought back, and the Pachteca developed sophisticated methods for collecting and transmitting information while maintaining their cover as ordinary merchants. They learned to recognize the significance of troop movements, changes in local leadership, and shifts in trade routes that might indicate new opportunities or emerging threats. The relationship between the Pachteca and the formal government of the empire was complex and carefully managed. The merchants operated with considerable independence, making their own decisions about where to travel, what to trade, and how to conduct their business. But they also served the empire's interests by extending its influence into regions that were too distant or difficult for military conquest, and by providing the luxury goods that the nobility required to maintain their status and conduct their ceremonies. The Pachteca maintained their own courts for settling disputes, their own religious festivals dedicated to their patron deities, and their own educational systems for training young merchants in the complex skills required for long-distance commerce. A young man apprenticing to become a Pachteca had to learn not only how to calculate exchange rates and negotiate prices, but also how to speak multiple languages, navigate by the stars, and conduct himself diplomatically in foreign courts. He had to understand the religious customs of different peoples well enough to avoid giving offense, and he had to develop the physical stamina necessary for journeys that might involve walking hundreds of miles while carrying heavy loads. The routes that the Pachteca traveled created a vast network of commercial relationships that connected the Aztec empire to peoples and places that had never been touched by its military campaigns. These trade routes were not simple paths through the wilderness, but complex systems of relationships with local guides, suppliers of food and shelter, and intermediaries who facilitated trade with peoples who lived even further from the Aztec heartland. Maintaining these relationships required constant attention and considerable diplomatic skill, as political changes in distant regions could disrupt trade routes that had taken decades to establish. The economic impact of the Pachteca's activities was enormous, both for the empire as a whole and for the communities they visited. In Tenochtitlan, the goods they brought back supported not only the luxury consumption of the elite, but also the craft industries that processed raw materials into finished products. The tropical feathers that Pachteca brought from distant forests were transformed by skilled artisans, into the elaborate headdresses and ceremonial costumes that played essential roles in religious ceremonies. The precious metals they imported were worked into jewelry and religious objects that were not only beautiful, but also served as stores of value and symbols of political alliance. The communities that the Pachteca visited also benefited from their activities, though in ways that were often less visible than the immediate transactions that took place in local markets. The Pachteca served as conduits for the exchange of ideas and technologies, carrying knowledge about new agricultural techniques, artistic styles, and manufacturing processes from one region to another. They also facilitated cultural exchange by serving as translators and intermediaries between peoples who might otherwise have had little contact with each other. The organization of Pachteca expeditions reveals something important about how trust and cooperation functioned in Aztec society. These expeditions involved enormous risks. Merchants might be killed by bandits. Their goods might be stolen by corrupt officials, or their trading partners might simply refuse to honor their agreements. Yet the Pachteca system continued to function because it was embedded in a larger network of social relationships that provided both incentives for honest dealing and mechanisms for enforcing agreements. The hereditary nature of the merchant guilds meant that a merchant's reputation affected not only his own prospects, but those of his children and grandchildren. The religious dimensions of the merchant guilds created additional bonds of trust and mutual obligation that helped to maintain cooperation even under difficult circumstances. As we consider the complexity and sophistication of the Pachteca system, we begin to see how the Aztec Empire functioned as something more than just a military alliance extracting tribute from conquered territories. The empire was also an economic network that facilitated commerce, cultural exchange, and technological innovation across a vast region. But this system of voluntary exchange coexisted uneasily with the empire's more coercive aspects, and the tensions between these different modes of organization would become increasingly important as the empire continued to expand and encounter new challenges by the early 1500s. The administrative machinery of the Aztec Empire had evolved into something that would have been recognizable to bureaucrats in any complex state throughout history: a vast network of scribes, tax collectors, warehouse managers, and administrative officials whose daily work involved the mundane but essential tasks of record-keeping, resource allocation, and communication that kept the empire functioning. Understanding how this bureaucracy actually operated day to day reveals both the remarkable sophistication of Aztec administrative methods and the enormous challenges involved in managing an empire that spanned hundreds of miles and included millions of people with diverse languages, customs, and economic systems. The foundation of the entire system was the tribute lists, detailed records that specified exactly what each tributary community was required to provide, when it was due, and in what quantities. These lists were not simple documents, but complex pictographic manuscripts that required specialized training to read and interpret. A single page might include symbols for dozens of different types of goods, numerical notations indicating quantities, calendar symbols showing when payments were due, and pictographs identifying the specific communities responsible for each tribute obligation. Creating and maintaining these records required not only literacy in the Aztec pictographic writing system, but also detailed knowledge of the empire's political structure, its economic resources, and its ceremonial requirements. The tribute scribes who maintained these records worked in specialized schools attached to the major temples, where they received training not only in writing and arithmetic, but also in the religious and ceremonial knowledge necessary to understand how tribute goods would be used. A scribe recording the tribute obligations for featherwork, for example, needed to know not only how to write the symbols for different types of feathers, but also which feathers were appropriate for different ceremonies, which combinations of colors had religious significance, and how the featherwork would be incorporated into the elaborate costumes worn by priests and nobles during festivals. The actual collection of tribute required a network of officials stationed throughout the empire, each responsible for overseeing tribute collection in his assigned region. These officials, called kalpixk, were typically appointed from among the noble families of Tenochtitlan or the other alliance cities, and they faced the challenging task of coordinating with local rulers who retained considerable autonomy while ensuring that tribute obligations were met on schedule. A kalpixk stationed in a distant province might be responsible for overseeing tribute collection from dozens of communities spread across hundreds of square miles, each with its own local customs, its own seasonal agricultural cycle, and its own political tensions that could affect tribute payments. The logistics of actually moving tribute goods from distant provinces to the imperial capitals were staggering. Tribute obligations often required communities to provide goods that had to be transported hundreds of miles over difficult terrain, much of it carried by human porters who could carry only limited loads and required food and shelter during their journeys. The timing of these shipments had to be carefully coordinated to ensure that perishable goods arrived when they were needed, that storage facilities were available when large shipments arrived, and that transportation routes were secure from bandits or enemy raids. The storage and distribution of tribute goods required another layer of administrative complexity. The empire maintained vast warehouses in its major cities, each specialized for particular types of goods and managed according to elaborate protocols that ensured proper preservation and accurate inventory control. The warehouses for textile tribute, for example, had to maintain careful climate control to prevent damage from humidity and insects, while the warehouses for food tribute required systems for rotating stock to prevent spoilage and for converting surplus goods into more durable forms that could be stored for longer periods. The distribution of tribute goods involved yet another set of administrative challenges. Some goods were reserved for specific ceremonial purposes and could be released only at particular times and according to specific protocols. Other goods were allocated to support the daily operations of the government, feeding the armies, supplying the craft workshops, or compensating officials for their services. Still other goods were redistributed to the empire's allies or given as diplomatic gifts to maintain relationships with neighboring powers. The record-keeping requirements for all these operations were enormous. Every transaction had to be recorded, every shipment had to be documented, and every allocation had to be justified according to established procedures. The empire developed sophisticated accounting methods that allowed administrators to track not only current inventories, but also historical patterns of tribute collection and distribution that could inform decisions about future allocations. These records were maintained not only in the pictographic writing system, but also through elaborate systems of knotted cords and other mnemonic devices that allowed information to be transmitted quickly and accurately across long distances. The human resources required to maintain this administrative system were substantial. The empire employed thousands of scribes, accountants, warehouse managers, and other administrative officials, most of whom came from the noble classes and received their training in the specialized schools that prepared young men for careers in government service. But the system also depended on the cooperation of local officials throughout the empire, many of whom were drawn from the traditional leadership of conquered communities and who had to balance their obligations to the empire with their responsibilities to their own people. The quality control mechanisms built into the tribute system reveal the empire's awareness that such a complex system was vulnerable to corruption, inefficiency, and simple human error. Tribute officials were subject to regular audits by imperial inspectors who would arrive unannounced to review records, examine stored goods, and investigate complaints from local communities. These inspections were not merely bureaucratic exercises, but serious evaluations that could result in officials being removed from their positions, required to make restitution for missing goods, or, in extreme cases, subjected to criminal prosecution. The Tribute system also had to accommodate the seasonal and annual variations that affected the empire's economic resources. Agricultural tribute varied depending on weather conditions, and the system had to include mechanisms for adjusting tribute. Obligations when communities faced crop failures or other disasters. Similarly, the demand for particular types of tribute goods varied depending on the ceremonial calendar, military campaigns, and diplomatic requirements. And the administrative system had to be flexible enough to respond to these changing needs, while maintaining overall stability and predictability. Perhaps most remarkably, this entire system operated without the benefit of wheeled transportation, draft animals, or standardized monetary systems. Everything was carried by human porters, calculated using base 20 mathematical systems, and recorded using pictographic writing that required years of specialized training to master. Yet the system was sufficiently sophisticated and reliable to support an empire that controlled more territory and more people than any previous state in Mesoamerican history. As the empire reached its peak in the early 1500s, its administrative machinery had become a complex organism capable of coordinating activities across vast distances and diverse populations. But this very complexity, which was the source of the empire's strength, was also creating vulnerabilities that would become apparent when the system faced unprecedented challenges from entirely unexpected directions. As the first light of dawn reflected off the waters of Lake Texcoco, the great city of Tenochtitlan began to stir with the quiet purposefulness that marked the daily routine of its common people. In the residential districts that surrounded the ceremonial center, families were already awake, beginning the routines that would occupy them until the sun set again over the western mountains. These were not the elaborate morning ceremonies of the nobility or the dramatic rituals of the priesthood, but the mundane and essential activities that kept the empire's greatest city functioning day after day, year after year. The typical commoner's home was a modest, single-story structure built around a small courtyard, constructed primarily of adobe bricks with a thatched roof and floors of packed earth. The family sleeping areas were simple rooms furnished with woven mats that served as beds, wooden chests for storing clothing and personal possessions, and braziers for warmth during the cooler months. But the heart of the home was the courtyard, where most of the family's daily activities took place: cooking, craftwork, childcare, and the countless small tasks that maintained the household's operations. The day began before sunrise with the lighting of the cooking fires, a task that typically fell to the women of the household. These fires were not casual affairs, but carefully tended sources of heat that would be maintained throughout the day for cooking, heating water, and providing light for various tasks. The fuel was usually wood or charcoal, both of which had to be purchased in the local markets, making fire management an important element of household economy. A family that allowed their fire to go out faced not only the inconvenience of rekindling it, but also the expense of purchasing additional fuel. The preparation of the morning meal was a complex process that required considerable skill and planning. The staple food was tortillas made from corn that had to be ground daily using a matot, a large stone grinding platform that required significant physical effort to operate effectively. The corn had been prepared days earlier through a process called nixtamalization, in which dried corn kernels were boiled with lime to remove the hulls and improve the nutritional value of the grain. This process, which modern nutritionists recognize as essential for preventing dietary deficiency diseases, is one of the many sophisticated food processing techniques that the Aztecs had perfected through centuries of experimentation. The grinding of corn was typically the responsibility of the household's women, and it was work that required both physical strength and technical skill. The matar had to be properly seasoned and maintained. The corn had to be ground to exactly the right consistency, and the entire process had to be timed to ensure that fresh tortillas would be available when the family was ready to eat. This was not simply a matter of preparing food, but of maintaining one of the fundamental skills that defined a competent household manager. While the women prepared the morning meal, the men of the household were typically engaged in their own morning preparations, which varied depending on their occupation and social status within their kalpuli. A farmer whose family maintained chinampas in the lake would check his equipment, review the day's agricultural tasks, and perhaps consult with neighbors about shared work projects. A craftsman who worked in obsidian textiles or pottery would organize his tools and materials, plan his production schedule, and consider any special orders or deadlines that required attention. The children of the household had their own morning responsibilities which served both practical and educational purposes. Young children helped with simple tasks like gathering fuel for the fire, carrying water from the community wells, or assisting with food preparation. Older children, particularly boys who were approaching the age when they would enter formal schooling, took on more substantial responsibilities that began to prepare them for their adult roles. These might include helping with agricultural work, learning basic craft techniques, or participating in the maintenance of community facilities. The morning meal itself was a social occasion that brought the family together before the day's work scattered them to their various activities. The food was simple but nutritious: tortillas served with beans, vegetables, and occasionally small amounts of meat or fish. The meal was typically accompanied by a drink made from corn or cacao, and families that could afford it might include fruits, nuts, or other foods purchased in the local markets. The conversation during the meal provided an opportunity for family members to coordinate their daily plans, share news from their respective activities, and maintain the social bonds that held the household together. After the morning meal, the day's primary activities began in earnest, and the rhythms of work that would occupy the family until evening started to assert themselves. For agricultural families, this meant traveling to their chinampas or other agricultural plots, often by canoe through the canal system that connected the residential districts to the farming areas around the city. These journeys were not just practical transportation, but social occasions when neighbors could share information about growing conditions, coordinate shared work projects, and maintain the relationships that were essential for community cooperation. The agricultural work itself was sophisticated and labor-intensive, requiring detailed knowledge of plant varieties, growing seasons, soil conditions, and water management techniques. A family maintaining several chinampas had to coordinate planting schedules to ensure continuous harvests throughout the growing season, manage the complex irrigation systems that kept their artificial islands productive, and maintain the organic matter and soil composition that made their plots so remarkably fertile. This work was physically demanding, but also intellectually challenging, requiring the kind of environmental knowledge that could only be acquired through years of careful observation and experimentation. For families whose primary occupation was craft production, the morning work routine involved different but equally demanding challenges. A family specializing in textile production, for example, had to coordinate the various stages of cloth making, spinning thread from cotton or agave fibers, dyeing the thread using complex recipes that produced the vibrant colors prized in Aztec society, and weaving the finished cloth on looms that required considerable skill to operate effectively. Each stage of this process required specialized knowledge and tools, and the quality of the finished product depended on careful attention to detail at every step. The market activities that were essential for most common families typically began in the mid-morning, when the major markets in each district opened for the day's business. These markets were not simply places to buy and sell goods, but social and information centers where community members could catch up on local news, coordinate shared projects, and maintain the relationships that were essential for daily life. A family might visit the market to sell surplus produce from their chinampas, to purchase materials needed for their craft work, or simply to gather information about prices, weather conditions, or political developments that might affect their daily routines. The children's education. which was a community responsibility rather than purely a family matter, also began in earnest during the morning hours. Young boys who had reached the appropriate age would report to the Telpochkali, the community school where they received instruction in basic military skills, community service, and the religious knowledge that every adult male was expected to possess. The curriculum at these schools was practical rather than theoretical, focusing on the skills and knowledge that students would need as adult members of their community. As the morning advanced toward midday, the city of Tenochtitlan was fully alive with the activities of its common people, the sounds of craftspeople at work, the movement of canoes through the canal system, the conversations of people conducting business in the markets, and the countless other sounds that marked a prosperous and busy urban community. Yet all of these activities were conducted within the larger framework of social obligations and community relationships that gave structure and meaning to individual efforts. The question that emerges from observing these morning routines is how such an apparently simple and traditional way of life could support the complex political and economic systems that made the Aztec Empire possible. But perhaps the answer lies not in any single dramatic innovation, but in the accumulated effect of thousands of small improvements and efficiencies that made everyday life more productive, more predictable, and more satisfying for the ordinary. People whose labor supported everything else the empire achieved as the common people of Tenochtitlan settled into their daily routines of agricultural work and craft production. An entirely different rhythm of life was unfolding in the palaces and ceremonial complexes that housed the empire's noble families. The world of the Pippleton, as the nobility were known, was governed by elaborate protocols, educational requirements, and ceremonial obligations that marked every aspect of their daily existence. To understand how Aztec society actually functioned, we must examine not only the productive labor of the commoners, but also the complex social and cultural work performed by the noble class. The physical environment in which noble families lived was dramatically different from the modest homes of the Kalpuli. Noble residences were typically large complexes built around multiple courtyards, with rooms specialized for different functions, private family quarters, reception areas for conducting official business, workshops for luxury crafts, and gardens, where ornamental plants and food crops were cultivated using the most advanced horticultural techniques. The construction of these buildings showcased the finest skills of Aztec architects and craftspeople. Walls of carefully fitted stone, roofs supported by elaborately carved wooden beams, and floors covered with woven mats of exceptional quality. The daily routine of noble families began with morning ceremonies that were more elaborate and more formally structured than the simple prayers that marked the beginning of the commoner's day. Noble households maintained private shrines dedicated to the family's patron deities, and the proper conduct of morning rituals was considered essential for ensuring the family's continued prosperity and political position. These ceremonies were typically conducted by the household head, often assisted by family members who had received specialized religious training, and they included offerings of food, incense, and other valuable materials. The clothing worn by noble families was itself a form of daily ceremony, as every garment was decorated with symbols that indicated the wearer's rank, achievements, and political affiliations. Getting dressed in the morning was not a simple matter of selecting practical clothing, but a complex process of communicating social information through visual symbols. The textiles worn by nobles were produced by the finest craftspeople in the empire, often incorporating precious materials like tropical feathers, gold thread, and precious stones. The patterns woven into these garments were not merely decorative, but conveyed specific meanings that could be read by anyone familiar with Aztec symbolic systems. The education of noble children was one of the most important responsibilities of elite families, and it shaped the daily routines of both children and adults throughout the household. Noble boys were typically sent to the Kamakak, the elite schools attached to the major temples where they received instruction in the complex body of knowledge considered essential for leadership positions. The curriculum at these schools was demanding and comprehensive, covering not only practical skills like military strategy and political administration, but also the theoretical knowledge required for religious leadership, astronomy, mathematics, calendar calculations, and the interpretation of sacred texts. The daily schedule at the Kamikak was rigorous and highly structured. Students rose before dawn to participate in religious ceremonies, followed by periods of intensive study that might focus on memorizing historical chronicles, learning the complex symbolism used in religious art, or practicing the mathematical calculations required for accurate calendar keeping. Physical training was also an important component of the curriculum, as noble boys were expected to become skilled warriors as well as effective administrators. But unlike the military training provided at the Telpochakali, which focused on practical combat skills, the military education at the Kamikak emphasized strategy, leadership, and the ceremonial aspects of warfare. The girls of noble families received their own specialized education, though it followed different patterns and served different purposes than the training provided to boys. Noble girls were typically educated within their family compounds by older women who were skilled in the complex arts, considered appropriate for elite women, advanced textile production techniques, the preparation of elaborate foods for ceremonial occasions, the management of large households, and the religious knowledge necessary for participating in the women's ceremonies that were an important part of Aztec religious life. The economic activities of noble families were more complex and more wide-ranging than those of commoner families. While commoners typically focused on a single occupation, farming, fishing, or craft production, noble families were involved in multiple economic enterprises simultaneously. A typical noble household might manage agricultural estates in several different ecological zones, oversee craft workshops that produced luxury goods for trade, maintain trading relationships with merchants from distant regions, and hold administrative positions that provided both income and political influence. The management of these diverse economic interests required sophisticated planning and coordination. Noble families maintained detailed records of their various holdings and investments, and they employed specialists who could provide expert knowledge about particular types of economic activity. A noble family with interests in long distance trade, for example, might employ advisors who were familiar with trade routes, market conditions, and the political situation in distant regions. Similarly, a family with extensive agricultural holdings might employ specialists in crop management, irrigation systems, and agricultural planning. The political responsibilities of the nobility created additional demands on their time and attention. Noblemen were expected to participate in the complex decision-making processes that governed the empire, attending council meetings, participating in diplomatic negotiations, and serving in administrative positions that required both technical expertise and political judgment. These responsibilities were not merely ceremonial, but involved real work that was essential for the empire's continued functioning. The ceremonial obligations of noble families were extensive and time-consuming, but they were also essential for maintaining the social relationships that held Aztec society together. Noble families were expected to sponsor religious festivals, participate in ceremonial occasions, and maintain the elaborate gift-giving relationships that cemented political alliances. These activities required substantial financial resources, but they also demanded considerable time and attention to ensure that ceremonies were conducted properly and that the appropriate social messages were communicated. The religious life of the nobility was more complex and more demanding than that of commoners, involving not only regular participation in public ceremonies, but also specialized knowledge and responsibilities that were considered essential for maintaining cosmic order. Many noblemen served part-time as priests, combining their secular responsibilities with religious duties that might include conducting ceremonies. interpreting omens, or maintaining the complex calendar calculations that determined when various rituals should be performed. The artistic and intellectual activities of noble families were another important aspect of their daily routines. Noble households were centers of cultural production, supporting poets, artists, and intellectuals whose work contributed to the cultural sophistication that was one of the hallmarks of Aztec civilization. A noble family might employ or patronize specialists in various arts, painters who created the elaborate murals that decorated temples and palaces, sculptors who carved the stone monuments that commemorated important events, or poets who composed the songs and chronicles that preserved historical memory and cultural values. The daily life of the nobility was also shaped by the constant need to maintain and display the status distinctions that defined Aztec social hierarchy. This was not simply a matter of personal vanity, but a social responsibility that helped to maintain the order and stability of the entire society. The elaborate costumes, the ceremonial protocols, the gift-giving relationships, and the cultural activities that filled the nobles' day all served to reinforce the artificial distinctions that made complex political and economic coordination possible. Yet, for all their privilege and luxury, the daily lives of noble families were also constrained by the very responsibilities that justified their elevated position in society. The education, ceremonies, political obligations, and cultural activities that filled their days were not optional entertainments, but essential duties that required constant attention and considerable personal sacrifice. The question that emerges from examining their daily routines is whether the complex social and cultural work performed by the nobility was as essential to the empire's success as the more obviously productive labor of the common people. While the nobles attended to political affairs and the commoners pursued their agricultural and craft activities, another layer of Aztec society was engaged in work that was essential for maintaining what the Aztecs considered the most important aspect of their civilization: the proper relationship between the human world and the cosmic forces that governed all existence. The priests, the specialized artisans who created religious objects, and the calendar specialists who calculated the timing of ceremonies represented a significant portion of Tenochtitlan's population, and their daily activities followed rhythms that were determined not by practical considerations of production and trade, but by the complex ceremonial calendar that regulated religious life throughout the empire. The priesthood was not a single unified profession, but a complex hierarchy of specialized roles, each with its own training requirements, daily responsibilities, and areas of expertise. At the highest levels were the priests who conducted the major ceremonies at the Templo Mayor and the other great temples of Tenochtitlan, men who had typically spent decades mastering the intricate knowledge required for their positions. Below them were priests who specialized in particular aspects of religious practice, calendar keepers who maintained the complex mathematical calculations required to coordinate the various ceremonial cycles, ritual specialists who knew the precise procedures for particular types of sacrifices and offerings, and temple administrators who managed the vast material resources required for religious ceremonies. The daily routine of a temple priest began several hours before dawn with purification, rituals that prepared him for the day's sacred work. These rituals were not simple ablutions, but elaborate procedures that might involve ritual bathing, the burning of specific types of incense, the recitation of prayers whose exact wording had been preserved for generations, and the performance of blood offerings that demonstrated the priest's commitment to his sacred duties. The physical demands of these purification rituals were considerable, and priests were expected to maintain the physical conditioning necessary to perform them properly day after day, year after year. The morning ceremonies at the major temples were spectacular affairs that drew participants from throughout the city. These were not simple prayer services, but elaborate theatrical productions that involved dozens of participants. complex musical accompaniments, and the manipulation of sacred objects whose creation had required months or years of specialized labor. The timing of these ceremonies was determined by astronomical observations and calendar calculations that represented some of the most sophisticated mathematical work performed in the pre-Columbian Americas. The calendar system that governed religious life was remarkably complex, involving the coordination of multiple cycles of different lengths that together created a ceremonial year of extraordinary richness and variety. The basic solar year of 365 days was divided into 18 months of 20 days each, plus 5 additional days that were considered particularly sacred and dangerous. Overlaid on this solar calendar was a ritual calendar of 260 days, created by the combination of 20-day signs with 13 numerical coefficients. The interaction between these two calendar systems created larger cycles that extended over periods of decades and centuries, allowing priests to plan ceremonies and predict significant events far into the future. The artisans who created the objects used in religious ceremonies were skilled professionals whose work required not only technical expertise, but also detailed knowledge of religious symbolism and ceremonial requirements. The featherworkers who created the elaborate headdresses and ceremonial costumes worn by priests and nobles during festivals were among the most highly regarded craftspeople in the empire. Their work required intimate familiarity with the symbolic meanings associated with different types of feathers, the technical skills necessary to attach thousands of individual feathers to textile backing in precise patterns, and the artistic vision to create objects that were both beautiful and religiously meaningful. The daily routine of a featherworker began with the selection and preparation of materials, a process that required careful examination of each individual feather to ensure that it met the exacting standards required for ceremonial use. Feathers had to be cleaned, sorted by color and size, and sometimes dyed to achieve the precise hues required for particular symbolic purposes. The actual construction of feathered objects was painstakingly slow work that required steady hands, sharp eyes, and the patience to attach hundreds or thousands of individual feathers according to predetermined patterns. The goldsmiths and silversmiths, who created religious jewelry and ceremonial objects, faced similar challenges, combining technical skills with religious knowledge to produce objects that served both practical and symbolic functions. The creation of a ceremonial mask or religious figurine required not only the ability to work precious metals with precision, but also understanding of the religious meanings associated with particular forms, the astronomical knowledge necessary to incorporate appropriate calendar symbols, and the artistic sensitivity to create objects that would inspire appropriate religious emotions in those who saw them. The stone carvers who created the monuments and architectural decorations that adorned Tenochtitlan's temples and palaces worked on an even larger scale, but their daily routines followed similar patterns of careful planning, precise execution, and constant attention to symbolic requirements. A major sculptural project might require months or years to complete, with teams of carvers working under the direction of master craftsmen who had spent decades perfecting their skills. The tools used for this work were primarily made of stone and obsidian, requiring techniques that were quite different from those used by metalworkers in other parts of the world. But the level of precision and artistic achievement they accomplished was remarkable by any standard. The painters who decorated manuscripts, temple walls, and ceremonial objects were also highly specialized professionals, whose work required mastery of complex symbolic systems as well as technical artistic skills. The pictographic writing system used in Aztec codices was not simply a method for recording information, but an art form that combined practical communication with aesthetic achievement. A scribe working on a tribute record or historical chronicle had to balance the need for accurate information transmission with the artistic requirements that made such documents beautiful as well as functional. The musical specialists who performed during religious Ceremonies were another essential component of the religious establishment, and their training and daily practice were as demanding as those of any other religious professional. Aztec religious music involved not only singing and instrumental performance, but also the coordination of music with dancing, ceremonial movements, and the timing of ritual actions. The training required to become an accomplished religious musician involved not only developing technical musical skills, but also memorizing vast repertoires of songs whose words and melodies had religious and historical significance. The daily life of these religious artisans and specialists was governed by the same ceremonial calendar that structured the work of the priests, but their responsibilities were more directly tied to the practical requirements of producing the objects and performances needed for particular ceremonies. A featherworker might spend months preparing costumes for a major festival, timing his work so that the finished objects would be ready precisely when they were needed. A stone carver working on a temple decoration had to coordinate his work with the construction schedule of the building project, ensuring that sculptural elements would be completed when they were needed for installation. The relationship between these religious specialists and the broader community was complex and multifaceted. On one hand, their work was essential for maintaining the ceremonial life that all Aztecs considered necessary for cosmic stability and social order. On the other hand, their specialized knowledge and their removal from ordinary productive activities sometimes created tensions with commoners who might question the value of elaborate religious expenditures during times of economic hardship. The training system that prepared young people for careers as religious specialists was extensive and demanding, involving years of apprenticeship under master craftsmen or experienced priests. This training was not simply technical education, but moral and spiritual preparation for careers that were considered essential for the well-being of the entire community. Young people who entered these training programs were making commitments that would shape their entire adult lives, dedicating themselves to forms of work that were both highly respected and enormously demanding as we observe the daily activities of priests, religious artisans, and calendar specialists. We begin to understand how Aztec society maintained the complex ceremonial life that was considered essential for cosmic order and social stability. But we also see how this elaborate religious establishment created both opportunities and challenges for a society that had to balance spiritual requirements with practical needs for economic production and political administration. In the year 1517, according to the Aztec calendar system that had governed the empire's ceremonial life for generations, a series of disturbing omens began to appear throughout the Valley of Mexico. These were not the ordinary signs that priests routinely interpreted as part of their daily religious duties, but extraordinary phenomena that seemed to suggest fundamental changes in the cosmic order that had sustained Aztec civilization for nearly 2 centuries. Temple fires that had burned continuously for decades suddenly went out without explanation. The Great Lake that surrounded Tenochtitlan rose without warning, flooding parts of the city that had never been touched by water. Most ominously, observers reported seeing a comet in the eastern sky, burning with an unusual brightness that persisted for months. For a society that understood all natural phenomena as manifestations of divine will, these omens demanded careful interpretation and appropriate responses. The priests responsible for reading such signs consulted their codices, performed divination ceremonies, and engaged in the complex mathematical calculations required to understand how these events fit into the larger patterns of cosmic time. But the conclusions they reached were deeply troubling. The auguries suggested that the current age of the world was approaching its end, and that the changes coming would be so fundamental that they might threaten the very survival of Aztec civilization. Moctezuma II, the Huey-Tlatoani who ruled the empire at its moment of greatest territorial extent and administrative sophistication, found himself facing challenges that no previous ruler had confronted. The tribute system was functioning smoothly. The military was at the height of its effectiveness. and the complex alliance structures that held the empire together were stable and productive. Yet the omens suggested that all these achievements might be rendered meaningless by forces beyond the empire's ability to control or even comprehend. The first concrete evidence that the omens might have practical significance came in 1518, when traders returning from the eastern coastal regions brought reports of strange vessels that had appeared on the horizon. These vessels were unlike any watercraft known to Mesoamerican peoples, enormous structures that moved without paddlers and carried men whose appearance and equipment were completely unfamiliar. The traders described beings with pale skin and hair that grew on their faces, wearing clothing that covered their entire bodies and carrying weapons that produced thunder and lightning. These reports created considerable debate among the priests and advisors who counseled Moctezuma. Some interpreted the strangers as manifestations of ancient prophecies that told of the return of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity who had once ruled in the east, and who was expected to return in the year Ceyacatl according to traditional calculations. Others argued that the strangers were merely representatives of distant peoples, perhaps powerful but fundamentally human and therefore manageable through traditional diplomatic methods. The intelligence network that had served the empire so effectively for military and commercial purposes was quickly directed toward gathering more detailed information about these mysterious visitors. The Puchteca, whose trading expeditions had given them extensive knowledge of coastal regions, were dispatched to make direct contact with the strangers and report back on their capabilities, intentions, and technology. The reports they brought back were both fascinating and deeply disturbing. The strangers, merchants reported, possessed technology that was completely outside Aztec experience. Their vessels were constructed of materials and according to principles that Mesoamerican shipbuilders had never imagined. Their weapons could kill at distances far greater than any bow or a spear, and they were accompanied by large four-legged animals that could carry men at speeds no human runner could match. Most remarkably, some of the strangers could make marks on flat surfaces that other strangers could interpret as speech, suggesting a form of communication that was far more sophisticated than the pictographic writing systems used in Mesoamerica. The social organization of the strangers was also puzzling to Aztec observers. They seemed to be organized according to principles that were different from any political system known in the region, with forms of authority and cooperation that did not correspond to familiar patterns of kinship, territory, or religious allegiance. Their leader, who is called Hernan Cortes, exercised power in ways that seemed to combine elements of military command, priestly authority, and royal prerogative, but according to principles that Aztec political theory could not easily explain. Perhaps most significantly, the strangers seemed to be interested in gold and silver, not as materials for creating beautiful and religiously meaningful objects, but simply as valuable substances that could be accumulated in large quantities. This attitude toward precious metals was so foreign to Aztec thinking that it was difficult for observers to understand what the strangers actually wanted, or how they might be satisfied. The Aztec use of gold and silver was primarily ceremonial and artistic. These metals were valued for their beauty and their association with the sun and moon, but they were not treated as stores of value in the way that seemed to motivate the strangers. The religious beliefs of the strangers were another source of confusion and concern. They seemed to worship a single deity, represented by the image of a man attached to a wooden cross, and they rejected the elaborate pantheon of gods and goddesses that governed Aztec religious life. This monotheistic system was not merely different from Aztec religion, seemed to be fundamentally incompatible with the cosmic understanding that underlay all aspects of Aztec civilization. The strangers' rejection of human sacrifice, in particular, suggested that they did not understand the essential role that blood offerings played in maintaining the balance between human society and the natural world. As reports about the strangers accumulated throughout 1518 and early 1519. The discussions in Tenochtitlan became increasingly urgent and increasingly divided. Some advisors counseled immediate military action to drive the strangers away before they could establish a permanent presence on the coast. Others argued for a diplomatic approach that would seek to understand the strangers' intentions and possibly incorporate them into the existing alliance structure as tribute-paying vassals. Still others suggested that the strangers might be divine beings, whose arrival represented a fundamental shift in cosmic order that would require entirely new forms of response. The administrative machinery of the empire, which had proven so effective at managing tribute collection, military campaigns, and diplomatic relationships, found itself dealing with challenges for which it had no precedents and no established procedures. The tribute records contained no categories for the kinds of goods that the strangers seemed to value. The military manuals included no strategies for dealing with enemies who possessed unknown weapons and fought according to unfamiliar tactics. The diplomatic protocols provided no guidance for negotiating with peoples whose political and religious systems were fundamentally different from anything known in Mesoamerica. The psychological impact of these developments on Aztec society was profound and far-reaching. For generations, the empire had expanded its territory, increased its tribute collections, refined its administrative systems according to patterns that seemed both successful and sustainable. The cosmic order that justified these achievements appeared stable and predictable, governed by religious principles that had been tested through centuries of practical application. But the arrival of the stranger suggested that this entire worldview might be incomplete or even mistaken. The months between the first reports of strange vessels and the actual arrival of Cortés and his expedition in the Valley of Mexico were filled with preparations that revealed both the strengths and the limitations of Aztec civilization. The tribute system was mobilized to provide resources for whatever response might be required. The military organization was activated to prepare for possible conflict. The diplomatic network was engaged to gather intelligence and explore possibilities for negotiation, but all these preparations were conducted within conceptual frameworks that might prove inadequate for dealing with challenges that were genuinely outside previous experience. As the year 1519 advanced and more detailed reports arrived from the coast, it became clear that the strangers were not simply going to go away or be easily incorporated into existing political arrangements. They were moving inland, making alliances with groups that had previously been subject to Aztec authority, and demonstrating both military capabilities and political skills that posed unprecedented challenges to imperial control. The empire that had seemed so stable and so sophisticated was about to face its greatest test. And the outcome would determine not only the fate of Aztec civilization, but the future of all Mesoamerica. By November 1519, Hernán Cortés and his small force of Spanish conquistadors had achieved something that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. They had marched from the coast to the heart of the Aztec Empire and been received as honored guests in Tenochtitlan itself. But this diplomatic triumph, which might have provided the foundation for peaceful coexistence between two very different civilizations, instead marked the beginning of a process that would destroy the political and social structures that had sustained Mesoamerican civilization for over a millennium. The initial reception of Cortés by Moctezuma II was a masterpiece of Aztec diplomatic protocol, conducted according to elaborate ceremonial procedures that were designed to incorporate powerful foreign visitors into the empire's existing alliance structure. Moctezuma housed the Spanish in the palace of his father. Ixayacatl provided them with food and attendance appropriate to their apparent status, and treated them with the respect due to representatives of a significant foreign power. But this traditional diplomatic approach failed to account for the fundamentally different objectives and methods that motivated the Spanish expedition. The Spanish were not interested in becoming tribute-paying allies or in establishing the kind of regulated, trading relationships that normally developed between the Aztec Empire and powerful neighbors. Instead, they were pursuing objectives that had no precedent in Mesoamerican political practice. The extraction of precious metals in quantities far larger than anything required for ceremonial or artistic purposes. The imposition of a religious system that rejected all the deities and practices that Aztecs considered essential for cosmic stability, and the establishment of a form of political control that would eliminate rather than incorporate existing leadership structures. The cultural misunderstandings that resulted from these different objectives created a series of increasingly dangerous situations throughout the winter of 1519 to 1520. The Spanish interpretation of Aztec hospitality as evidence of weakness or submission led them to make demands that were completely outside Aztec expectations for diplomatic relationships. When they requested to see the empire's gold reserves, Moctezuma complied as a gesture of goodwill. But the Spanish reaction intense interest in the metal itself rather than in the aperitic objects that had been crafted from it revealed objectives that were incomprehensible within Aztec frameworks for understanding political relationships. The religious conflicts that developed during this period were even more fundamental and more difficult to resolve through traditional diplomatic methods. The Spanish insisted on conducting their own religious ceremonies within the ceremonial center of Tenochtitlan, and they expressed horror at the human sacrifice that Aztecs considered essential for maintaining cosmic order. These religious differences were not merely matters of personal belief, but fundamental disagreements about the nature of the universe and humanity's role within it. The Spanish rejection of human sacrifice struck at the heart of Aztec cosmology, while the Aztec continuation of traditional religious practices appeared to the Spanish as evidence of demonic influence that required immediate intervention. The political crisis that had been building throughout the winter came to a head in the spring of 1520. When Pedro de Alvarado, acting as Cortes' lieutenant, ordered an attack on Aztec nobles who were participating in a traditional religious festival. This massacre was not the result of military strategy or immediate self-defense, but appears to have been motivated by Spanish religious objections to Aztec ceremonial practices and by Alvarado's apparent belief that preemptive violence would intimidate the Aztec leadership into submission. The Aztec response to this unprecedented violation of diplomatic protocol and religious sanctuary was swift and decisive. The uprising that began immediately after the massacre was not a spontaneous outburst of popular anger, but a coordinated military response organized according to the well-established procedures that the empire used for dealing with rebellions and external threats. The Calpulli that formed the basic military organization of Tenochtitlan mobilized their warriors. The causeways that connected the city to the mainland were cut to prevent Spanish escape, and the systematic siege of the Spanish position in Ixiosost Palace began. But the military situation was more complex than a simple conflict between Spanish invaders and Aztec defenders. Courts had spent months building alliances with groups that had their own grievances against Aztec rule, particularly the Tlaxcalans, who had maintained their independence despite repeated Aztec military campaigns, and various tributary communities that resented the tribute obligations imposed by the empire. These alliances provided the Spanish with sources of military support, logistical assistance, and local knowledge that proved essential for their survival during the crisis in Tenochtitlan. The death of Moctezuma II during this uprising marked a fundamental turning point in both the immediate military situation and the longer-term political dynamics of the conflict. The circumstances of his death remain controversial, Spanish sources claim. He was killed by stones thrown by his own people during an attempt to calm the uprising, while indigenous sources suggest he was murdered by the Spanish, but the political consequences were clear. With the death of the Huey Tlatoani, the elaborate administrative and ceremonial systems that had held the empire together lost their central coordinating authority at the moment when such coordination was most desperately needed. The Spanish escaped from Tenochtitlan. On the night of June 30th, 1520, an event they called the Noche Triste, or Night of Sorrows, was both a military defeat for courts and a missed opportunity for the Aztecs to eliminate the Spanish threat permanently. The fighting during the Spanish retreat was fierce and costly for both sides, with hundreds of Spanish soldiers and thousands of their Tlaxcalan allies killed or captured. But enough Spanish survived, including Cortes himself and most of his key lieutenants, to regroup and plan a return campaign. The year that followed the Spanish retreat was a period of frantic preparation on both sides, as each attempted to recover from their losses and prepare for the resumption of hostilities. For the Aztecs, this meant dealing with the succession crisis created by Moctezum's death, attempting to restore the alliance relationships that had been damaged by the crisis, and preparing the city's defenses for what was clearly going to be a prolonged siege. Cuitlahuac, who succeeded Moctezuma as Huey Tlatoani, faced the enormous challenge of maintaining imperial unity while dealing with the practical and psychological effects of the unprecedented events of the previous year. The Spanish, meanwhile, were rebuilding their forces and refining their strategy based on what they had learned during their months in Tenochtitlan. Cortes understood that the key to Spanish success lay not in direct military confrontation with the Aztec forces, but in exploiting the political divisions within the empire and maintaining the alliances with tributary communities that provided both military support and logistical assistance. The Spanish also began construction of a fleet of brigantines that would allow them to control Lake Texcoco and cut off the supply lines that connected Tenochtitlan to the mainland. The most devastating development during this period of preparation was the epidemic of smallpox that began spreading throughout central Mexico in the fall of 1520. This disease, which was endemic in Europe and to which Spanish had developed some immunity, was completely new to the Americas, and it spread with catastrophic effects through populations that had no previous exposure and no acquired immunity. Cuitlahuac himself died of smallpox in December 1520, creating another succession crisis at the worst possible moment for Aztec resistance. Cuauhtémoc, who became the last independent Huey Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan, inherited a situation that was rapidly becoming impossible to manage through traditional methods. The tribute system was breaking down as tributary communities joined the Spanish alliance or simply stopped sending their required payments. The population of Tenochtitlan was being decimated by disease as well as by the effects of the ongoing conflict. Most critically, the city's food supply was becoming increasingly precarious as Spanish control of the lake and their alliances with agricultural communities around the valley made it impossible to maintain the complex logistical systems that had fed the city's population for nearly 2 centuries. When Cortes returned to begin the final siege of Tenochtitlan in May 1521, he commanded not just the Spanish forces that had survived the previous year's fighting, but a coalition that included thousands of indigenous warriors from throughout central Mexico. The siege that followed was not simply a military confrontation, but a systematic effort to destroy the infrastructure that had made Aztec civilization possible. The Spanish and their allies cut the causeways that connected the city to the mainland, destroyed the chinampas that provided food for the urban population, and used their brigantines to control the lake and prevent supplies from reaching the city. The fighting during the final siege was characterized by a level of desperation and brutality that exceeded anything in the previous conflicts. The defenders of Tenochtitlan were fighting not just for military victory, but for the survival of their entire way of life. Every street and canal became a battleground, every temple and palace became a fortress, and every day of continued resistance became more difficult as food, water, and ammunition ran short. Yet the resistance continued for over 2 months, sustained by a combination of military skill, religious conviction, and the simple recognition that surrender would mean the end of everything the defenders had spent their lives building and protecting. The final assault on August 13, 1521, was less a military victory than a humanitarian catastrophe that marked the end of independent Mesoamerican civilization. But the question that emerges from examining these events is whether the outcome was inevitable, or whether different decisions by leaders on both sides might have produced different results that could have preserved more of what had made Aztec civilization one of the remarkable achievements in human history. The fall of Tenochtitlan on August 13, 1521, marked not merely the end of a military campaign, but the beginning of a transformation so fundamental that it would reshape every aspect of life in central Mexico for centuries to come. The city that had been the political, economic, and ceremonial center of the most sophisticated indigenous civilization in the Americas was systematically dismantled. Its stones used to build churches and colonial administrative buildings, its canals filled in to create streets suitable for wheeled vehicles and horses, its palaces and temples replaced by structures designed according to European architectural principles. Yet the physical destruction of Tenochtitlan was only the most visible aspect of changes that penetrated every level of society and every aspect of daily life. The cow pulley system that had organized neighborhoods and regulated community life for generations was replaced by Spanish administrative units based on very different principles of social organization. The tribute system that had coordinated economic relationships across the empire was transformed into a colonial taxation structure designed to extract wealth for shipment to Spain rather than to support local ceremonial and administrative activities. Most fundamentally, the religious practices that had provided meaning and structure to Aztec life were suppressed and replaced by Christianity, creating spiritual and cultural disruptions whose effects would persist for generations. The demographic catastrophe that accompanied these political and cultural changes was unprecedented in human history. The smallpox epidemic that had begun during the siege continued to spread throughout the former empire, killing an estimated 80 to 90% of the indigenous population over the course of the 16th century. Entire communities disappeared, leaving only archaeological traces of settlements that had existed for centuries. The complex agricultural systems that had sustained dense populations were abandoned, and vast areas that had been carefully cultivated for generations returned to wilderness. For the survivors of this demographic collapse, a challenge of maintaining cultural continuity under colonial rule required strategies of adaptation and resistance that were as sophisticated as anything their ancestors had developed for governing an empire. The Spanish colonial system was designed to extract wealth and labor from indigenous communities while suppressing the political and religious institutions that had previously provided structure and meaning to indigenous life. But the indigenous response to these pressures was not passive acceptance, but active cultural negotiation that preserved essential elements of pre-Columbian civilization while adapting to colonial realities. One of the most important aspects of this cultural preservation was the continued production of codices and other written records that maintained knowledge of pre-Columbian history, religious practices, and social organization. These documents were often created by indigenous scribes working under Spanish supervision, but they incorporated traditional pictographic elements and preserved information that might otherwise have been completely lost. The Florentine Codex, compiled by the Franciscan missionary Bernardino de Sahag, with the assistance of indigenous informants, provides one of our most detailed sources of information about Aztec daily life, religious practices, and social organization. The process of creating these colonial period codices reveals something important about how indigenous communities adapted to Spanish rule while maintaining their own cultural traditions. The scribes who worked on these projects had to balance the demands of Spanish patrons, who were interested in gathering information that would help them understand and control indigenous populations, with their own community obligations to preserve traditional knowledge for future generations. The resulting documents often contain multiple layers of meaning, with information that satisfied Spanish curiosity while also encoding traditional knowledge in forms that could be understood by indigenous readers. The religious transformations of the colonial period were particularly complex, involving not simply the replacement of indigenous deities with Christian saints, but the development of syncretic religious practices that combined elements from both traditions. The Virgin of Guadalupe, whose shrine was built on the site of a pre-Columbian temple dedicated to the goddess Tonantzin, became a powerful symbol of this religious synthesis, representing both Christian and indigenous spiritual traditions in ways that allowed colonial period indigenous communities to maintain connections to their ancestral beliefs while participating in the colonial religious system. The economic adaptations required by colonial rule were equally complex and equally important for community survival. The tribute system that had regulated economic relationships within the Aztec Empire was replaced by colonial taxation and labor requirements that were designed to support Spanish colonial administration and to generate profits that could be shipped to Spain. But indigenous communities developed strategies for meeting these colonial obligations while maintaining enough resources to support their own survival and cultural continuity. The encomienda system, which granted Spanish colonists the right to collect tribute and labor from specific indigenous communities, created new forms of economic relationship that were neither traditional Mesoamerican tribute arrangements nor familiar European feudal relationships. Indigenous leaders had to learn to navigate these new systems while protecting their communities from the worst abuses of colonial exploitation. This required diplomatic skills that were as sophisticated as anything their predecessors had used in dealing with other indigenous political entities. The linguistic changes of the colonial period present another example of adaptation and resistance operating simultaneously. Spanish became the language of colonial administration, legal proceedings, and formal education. And indigenous people who wanted to participate in colonial political and economic systems had to learn to operate in Spanish. But Nahuatl and other indigenous languages continued to be spoken in indigenous communities. And they evolved to incorporate Spanish vocabulary and concepts while maintaining their essential grammatical and conceptual structures. The educational institutions that developed during the colonial period reflect these same patterns of adaptation and resistance. The Spanish established schools designed to train indigenous people for roles in colonial society, teaching Spanish language, Christian doctrine, and European-style crafts. But indigenous communities also maintained their own informal educational systems that transmitted traditional knowledge about agriculture, crafts, history, and religious practices from one generation to the next. The artistic traditions of the colonial period show perhaps the most visible evidence of cultural synthesis and continuation. Indigenous artists working in colonial contexts learned European artistic techniques and Christian iconography, but they often incorporated traditional design elements, symbols, and aesthetic principles into their work. Church decorations, manuscript illustrations, and ceremonial objects from the colonial period frequently combine Spanish and indigenous elements in ways that created new forms of artistic expression, while maintaining connections to pre-Columbian traditions. The political adaptations required by colonial rule were equally sophisticated and equally important for community survival. The Spanish colonial system eliminated the traditional political institutions that had governed indigenous communities, but it also created new opportunities for indigenous leadership within the colonial framework. Indigenous nobles who could demonstrate their aristocratic status according to Spanish criteria were sometimes allowed to maintain positions of local authority, serving as intermediaries between Spanish colonial administrators and indigenous communities. These indigenous colonial leaders faced the challenge of protecting their communities from Spanish exploitation while also maintaining their own positions within the colonial hierarchy. This required diplomatic skills, legal knowledge, and cultural flexibility that allowed them to operate effectively in both indigenous and Spanish cultural contexts. Some of these leaders became remarkably successful at using Spanish legal institutions to defend indigenous land rights and community autonomy, creating legal precedents that would influence indigenous Spanish relationships for centuries. As we consider the long-term consequences of the Spanish conquest and the indigenous responses to colonial rule, we begin to understand that the end of the Aztec Empire was not simply the destruction of one political system and its replacement by another, but the beginning of a complex process of cultural negotiation and adaptation that created new forms of identity and community organization. The colonial period represents not just the aftermath of conquest, but the beginning of new chapters in the ongoing history of indigenous peoples who found ways to survive, adapt, and maintain essential elements of their cultural traditions under conditions that might have seemed impossible to overcome. The legacy of the Aztec Empire thus extends far beyond the dramatic events of conquest and resistance to include the quieter, but equally important processes of cultural preservation, adaptation, and renewal that allowed indigenous communities to maintain their identity and their connections to their ancestral traditions even under the most difficult circumstances. Understanding this longer history helps us appreciate not only what was lost in the conquest, but also what survived and continued to evolve in new forms that enrich the cultural heritage of Mexico and the broader Americas. As our journey through the entire story of the Aztec Empire comes to its conclusion, we find ourselves contemplating not just the rise and fall of a political entity, but the remarkable human achievement of creating one of the world's most sophisticated civilizations. In the challenging environment of central Mexico, from the humble beginnings of a nomadic people following a divine prophecy to the complex administrative machinery that governed millions of people across hundreds of thousands of square miles, the Aztec Empire represents an extraordinary example of human creativity, organizational skill, and cultural achievement. The story we have followed reveals that the greatness of Aztec civilization lay not in any single dramatic innovation, but in the accumulated effect of thousands of small improvements and adaptations, the development of Chinampa agriculture that could feed dense urban populations, the creation of tribute systems that coordinated economic activity across vast distances, the establishment of educational institutions that transmitted complex knowledge from one generation to the next, and the maintenance of religious practices that provided meaning and structure to daily life for millions of people. Perhaps most importantly, our exploration of Aztec history demonstrates that the encounter between indigenous American civilizations and European colonialism is not a simple story of primitive peoples being overwhelmed by superior technology, but a complex process of cultural conflict and negotiation between two sophisticated but very different ways of organizing human society. The tragic outcome of this encounter should not obscure our recognition that both sides represented remarkable achievements in human cultural development, and that the indigenous peoples of the Americas had created civilizations that were in many ways as complex and sophisticated as anything that existed elsewhere in the world at that time. The legacy of the Aztec Empire continues to influence Mexican and broader American culture in ways that extend far beyond the tourist attractions and popular images that dominate contemporary perceptions. The agricultural techniques developed by Aztec farmers are still used in parts of central Mexico. The artistic traditions established by Aztec craftspeople continue to influence contemporary Mexican art. The political and social institutions created by Aztec administrators provided models for community organization that persisted through the colonial period and into the modern era. Most fundamentally, The story of the Aztec Empire reminds us that human societies are capable of achievements that far exceed what might seem possible given the limitations of their material resources and technological capabilities. The Aztecs built one of the world's great civilizations without wheeled vehicles, draft animals, iron tools, or written language as we usually understand it. They created architectural monuments that rival anything built in the ancient world, developed mathematical and astronomical knowledge that was remarkably sophisticated, and established political and economic systems that successfully governed vast territories and diverse populations for over a century. As we drift off to sleep, we might reflect on how the daily routines of Aztec farmers tending their chinapas, nobles conducting their ceremonial obligations, priests maintaining their sacred calculations, and merchants traveling their distant trade routes all contributed to a civilization that, despite its ultimate fate, achieved something truly remarkable in human history. In the quiet darkness, we can perhaps still hear the echo of voices speaking Nahuatl across the waters of Lake Texcoco, still see the light of temple fires reflecting off the lake's surface, and still sense the presence of a people who created beauty and meaning in their lives despite the challenges they faced and the tragic end that awaited their empire. The story of the Aztecs is ultimately a story about human potential, about what people can accomplish when they work together with purpose, creativity, and determination. It is a story that transcends the specific historical circumstances of 15th and 16th century Mexico to speak to universal themes about how societies develop, how cultures adapt to challenges, and how human beings create meaning and beauty in their lives despite the knowledge that all their achievements are ultimately temporary. In contemplating their story, we are contemplating not just the past, but the ongoing human journey of which we are all a part.